Hello, English lovers, learners, and book lovers. I'm Lydie Bureau, and welcome to our October live read along. I'm an English teacher in France, and I'm also the founder of Lydie's book club for learners of English. In this book club, I host live readings and workshops on adaptations of classics of literature and contemporary novels in their original text. I also tend to prioritize books that are written by women. Each month, reread and explore a different book for all levels of English. And at the end of each reading week, I meet the members of the book club in a live workshop session via Zoom to discuss the chapters read over that week. And this month, we are reading the C1 adaptation of North and South. So this is for advanced learners of English. It was originally written by Elizabeth Gaskell, and this is an adaptation made or published by the editor Penguin Readers. And this is a 2008 edition. If you want to know more about the novel and in Elizabeth Gaskell's work, I invite you to listen to the podcast episode 25, an introduction to Elizabeth Gaskell and North and South, which is available on Ladies Book Club YouTube channel here on this YouTube channel, and also on the Spotify podcast Read in English. So today it is our third live reading session, and we're going to read chapters 5 and 6. And this Saturday, I will host the second live workshop session, and we will cover chapters 5 to 8. So the 4 chapters that we're going to read this week. So if you want to attend this live session, just subscribe to the book club and join us live on Zoom and practice your English, your speaking skills, and your critical thinking skills as well to reflect on the characters, but also on the novel as a whole and society in the Victorian time, and reflect on our society, what has changed and what needs to be changed, and what things we still have to work on. And there are so many topics to talk about. So you can find all the information and upcoming dates of the live readings and workshop on my website. So you can find the link in the description and all of this video, of course. And all my Instagram live readings are recorded and made available here on this YouTube channel. So you can watch it at your own pace, and also on Spotify podcasts. So you can find all these live readings on Leaders Book Club, Read in English, Spotify podcast. So now this is it. This is the time to recap now the chapters that we read last week, the last chapters. So as usual, I do a quick recap. And so today I'm going to recap chapter 3 and 4. So it's going to be a good reminder for those of you who read the chapters a week ago and might have forgotten a little bit about it. So it's a nice reminder. And for those of you who are just who are watching this video without having read the book first, the chapters yet, then it's just going to give you a little glimpse of what it's going to be about. And I'm just going to put a bit more light on. Yep, here we go. That's it. Okay. So, chapter 3, the move to Milton Northern. So, remember, Margaret and her parents are have to leave Helston, their beloved um, the village where they live. Unfortunately, Margaret's father is having doubts on his beliefs on the church with in relation to the Church of England and its own beliefs. So he's kind of forced, or he feels the need to go somewhere else to feel more useful and where he will be more understood and be surrounded by people who will share the same ideas and the same ideal of um, of life, and especially in relation to the way of living for poor people and working class. So, in the sense that, in the sense, in form of improving, being part of a movement that will improve um, social condition or living condition of the poor. So they moved to this town in north of England called Milton Northern. And as I talked about in the podcast, in the introduction of this book, and on Elizabeth Gaskell, Milton Northern is actually inspired by Manchester, the town of Manchester. Well, no, it's a city, it's a big town, city. Uh, where Elizabeth Gaskell grew up. Well, she grew up in a small village near Manchester, but then she built her life there. She lived in Manchester most of her life. So she was this is a love letter in a way to Manchester and the north of England and the working class population. So they moved to Milton Northern, but it's a little bit tricky to adjust because the air is not the same. There's a lot of smoke coming out from the mills and the factories, because in the north we are producing cotton and wool, and there are a lot of factories. And the air is not as clean as in the south, where there are not much factories, more farmers and farm animals, so they don't make smoke in a way. So this town is very dark, and it's in the north, so there are less sun, I guess. Well, if you know a little bit about England, in north of England, you know that it rains a lot, and it's kind of gray most of the time, and the smoke doesn't help here as well. So it's very gloomy kind of atmosphere. And Mrs. Hell, so Margaret's mother, finds it really hard to adjust to this part of England. Um, and obviously, being a patriarchal society, the men take the decision. The father decided that they had to move, so the women follow. And Margaret has the difficult task to tell her mother about the news because her father didn't tell her mother. So he took the decision without consulting his wife. So it's um, kind of he just take it as a given. There is no question of in the 19th century here, you clearly see that there is no question of balance in the couple and a sense that the woman, the wife, has a say in the decision of the couple. The decision maker is the husband. So Margaret has to announce to her mother that they need to leave Helston. So Mrs. Hale was already kind of was quite low, had a low spirit because she found that the house, the vicarage where they live, the property that is next to, I guess, the church, is quite isolated from the town, the center of the town, and where there are other, where they could socialize with other wealthy family. So Mrs. Health is quite find it hard to live in this house, although she enjoys having a walk around. Hello, Ada. Thank you for joining today. I didn't get the time to listen to your message, but I will definitely for your vocal message. I hope you enjoy this live reading. So Mrs. Hale find it really difficult already in Helston, and now they need to leave to the north, where they have no relations. They only this man, Mr. Thornton, and who will help them to find a house. But other than that, and Mr. Hall's friend, Mr. Bell, that is an old friend from Oxford who put in touch with Mr. Thornton. But other than that, they don't know anyone there, and it's um, it's another issue that they will have to face. So they move there, and Margaret has to take care of all the arrangements before the departure. And she step into this new role of respond and these having these responsibilities for her parents and the moving out. So remember, Margaret was living in London with her aunt, and then she had to leave the house because her cousin got married, and that meant that she had to go back to her parents. And and when she transitioned from London to Helston, it's already a big change, but she enjoys her time in Helston, and she's still in this very childish or maybe naive state of mind. And now seeing the state of her mother and the and her father as well, not really being in his right mind about the idea of moving, having to move out of the town. She take on the whole burden of having to look at the logistic of the moving out. And in a sense, she's becoming a real adult now, having responsibility and having to be responsible of her parents and the well-being of her parents. So that's what chapter and when they arrive in Milton Northern, they have to find a place. And here again, Margaret has to take care of getting in touch and finding the place with, well, with her father. They go together to find a new place. And there she will meet for the first time Mr. Thornton, because she goes back to the hotel where they are staying, and there Mr. Thornton is expecting to see an old man, Mr. Hale, but instead he meets Mrs. Well, Margaret Hale, and at this and in this first encounter, Mr. Thornton is very, how to say, taken by the beauty of Margaret and her posture and the way she walks, and how she addresses herself. Address She addresses to him in a very polite, and you can and the way she's dressed as well. She wore a simple dark silk dress and a large Indian shawl that made her look like an Eastern queen. So he's putting her on a pedestal, um, because of the way she behave. Well, she walk around the room. That comes from her education in this her bringing in the high society of London. So she's used to society and to welcome people. And of course, Mr. Thornton is not really used to be around such um, manners and around the young woman that holds herself um, in such a way, and she seems to be quite uninterested to him. She just is as anyone else. She doesn't she barely notices him. So that hurts him a little bit in his pride. And he's about to leave the room when Mr. Hill comes in, and they start chatting. So this is how chapter 3 ends. And chapter 4, we we meet a new character. Yeah, we meet Nicholas Egan's, who is a worker in a mill factory. Yes, not Mr. Thornton's factory, but another. And as I forgot, yeah, also I forgot to mention that Mr. Thornton is a tradesman. He is an owner, a factory owner, and a mill owner. So he acquired his wealth through business and through um, trade. So, well, yeah, through his business. So he earned his money, and not it it wasn't born rich, because we learn in uh, um, in chapter 4 actually, because Margaret's father uh, tell his daughter that Mr. Thornton's father lost the money uh, that they had, and he hanged himself. He killed himself. So it's very tragic. Hi, hello, Etienne. Welcome to the live. And he killed himself. So he died in very tragic circumstances, as you can imagine. So John Thornton had to work really hard and stop school at a very young age to start working in a shop and earn enough money for his sister and his mother. And little by little, he managed to reimburse, to give back all the money that his father owned, because not only the father lost all the money, but he lost it but he owned money to other people. So the family was in debts. Though they had a lot of debts, and that's probably one of the reason why his father killed himself. So John had to earn the trust of everyone else, and he managed to earn respect, the respect of all the business owners and mill owners as well in the town. So you can see here the character, Mr. Thornton's character, and his value, his ethical value in terms of yeah, his ethical value. That's that's it. So that's what we learn in chapter 4. Also, we learn more about Frederick. Frederick is Margaret's brother, and we know that he left England in very mysterious circumstances. He had to leave England, otherwise he would be arrested, and now we know why. We know that he rebelled. He was a soldier in the Navy. He was an officer, a senior officer, and he disagreed with his captain. And in order to protest against his captain, he organized a mutiny. And this mutiny was reported back to the justice and the military justice, and he was held responsible of the mutiny. So he left. Otherwise, he would have been arrested and hanged for going against orders of his superior, orders of the crown, basically, and the English government. So he left to South Africa, South America, sorry, and for several years, and he ended up in Spain now. He lives in Spain as at the time where Margaret's mother is talking. And somewhere in Cadiz, so in the south of Spain. So Margaret is quite happy about the fact that her mother finally opens up to her and not to Dixon only, because Dixon is Mrs. Hale's help, Mrs. Hale's maid, since before she was married. So she was her maid. She has been her maid for a long time. And they are very close with each other, close to each other. And Dixon is Mrs. Hale's confidant. And Margaret finds it hard to to find her place um, with in her mother's life, and being um, being appreciated, I guess, for being her daughter, and yeah, to be acknowledged in a way by her mother and be noticed by her mother. So we can clearly see she has a closer relationship with her father than with her mother. But at this point, when Mrs. Hale is finally opening up to her about her brother, about the real reason that why her brother has left, is very comforting for Margaret. And there is here a form of evolution in their relationship, as you can see. Right. So that being done, let's get started with chapter 5. A strike begins. So strike is when workers don't want to work anymore because they disagree on the rules in the company, or they want a better salary, better wages, or they want better work condition. 4 or 5 days after his visit to the Hells, Mr. Thornton decided that his mother and sister should also visit them, but he had some difficulty persuading them to do so. Mrs. Thornton did not often go out visiting, and she did not understand why she should become friends with a teacher. Eventually she agreed, but it was then Fanny's turn to protest. "I'm not coming," she said. "I have a headache today." "Fanny, I wish you to go," said her brother, authoritatively. "Please go without me saying any more about it. Please go without me saying anything more about it." Mrs. Thornton sighed. Unlike her mother and her brother, Fanny was not a strong character, and Mrs. Thornton had an unconscious contempt for those who were weak. She behaved lovingly towards her daughter, and a stranger might have thought that she loved her more than her son. The opposite was true. The honesty with which mother and son spoke to each other showed the great respect they had for each other's strength. Mrs. Thornton thanked God for her son every day of her life. So although they didn't seem to be close to each other, when as an external person you could see that they're very harsh to either, well, they speak truly to each other, would seem that they have a very distant relationship, but actually it shows how close they are. It shows that they have it's actually a lot of respect that is displayed here. The honesty with which mother and son spoke to each other showed the great respect they had for each other's strength. Mrs. Thornton thanked God for her son every day of her life. That afternoon, Mrs. Thornton and Fanny set out in their carriage for Crampton. When she entered the Hells' little sitting room, Mrs. Thornton, who was shy and hated meeting strangers, hid her shyness by looking even more severe than usual. She and Mrs. Hale started a conversation about servants, while Margaret, who was sewing, tried hard to talk to Fanny. "I see no piano, so I suppose you're not musical?" said Fanny. "I am fond of good music, but I cannot play well myself. We sold our old piano when we came here." "How can you exist without one? A piano is a necessity." "You have good concerts here, I believe," said Margaret coldly. "Oh, yes, one is sure to hear the newest music here." Do you like new music then? Oh, one knows it is the fashion in London. You have been to London, of course. Yes, said Margaret. I lived there for several years. Have you ever been? Have you never been there? It is an easy journey by train. I would love to go, but mother does not wish to. She's very proud of Milton, you see. To me, it is a dirty, smoky place, but I believe she admires it for those qualities. If it has been Mrs. Thornton's home for some years, I can understand her loving it, said Margaret in her clear voice. May I ask you are saying about me, Miss Hell? Asked Mrs. Thornton. Fanny replied, Oh, mother, we're trying to understand why you're so fond of Milton. Thank you, said Mrs. Thornton. I do not feel that my natural liking for the place where I was born requires an explanation. Margaret was cross that Fanny had made it seem that they had been criticizing her mother. She also disliked the way Mrs. Thornton had spoken to her. So remember, Mrs. Thornton doesn't like Miss Hell. She doesn't know her, but she doesn't like her. The way her sons describe, well, she has a sense that Miss Hell has an impact on has effect on her son, um, and she doesn't like it. She wants to have her son for herself. Um, where was I? After a pause, Mrs. Thornton said, Do you know anything about Milton, Miss Hale? Have you visited our splendid factories? No, said Margaret honestly. I don't think I would regretfully enjoy visiting such places. I would greatly enjoy visiting such places. No doubt, said Mrs. Thornton, sounding displeased. I thought that as newcomers to a manufacturing town, you might have been interested in finding out more about its business. Soon after this, the visit ended. Fanny, said her mother as they drove away, we will be polite to these Hales, but don't become friendly with the daughter. She will do you no good. The mother looks very ill and seems a nice, quiet kind of person. Well, I suppose John will be satisfied now. The next day, Mr. Hale and Margaret returned Mrs. Thornton's visit. To their surprise, they discovered that the Thorntons lived next to their mill in Marlborough Street. Behind a long wall, there was a large yard with offices on one side and the mill on the other. At the end of the yard was a tall, attractive house. They knocked at the door and were taken upstairs to a large sitting room. Mrs. Thornton entered a few minutes later. How is Mr. Thornton? Asked Mr. Hale. He was unable to come for his lesson yesterday, and I was afraid he was not well. My son is rarely ill. He told me he was too busy to visit you last night, but I know he values the hours he spends with you. I find them equally pleasant, said Mr. Hale. He has such an appreciation of ancient Greek literature. I have no doubt that to know ancient Greek is desirable for those who do not work. But I advise my son not to study it. His work requires all his attention. It ought to be enough to him to have one great desire and to aim only at that. So in a sense, so it feels like for Mrs. Thornton, there is no possibility to be literate, to like literature, and being a businessman. The two can't be combined. And that's a belief that existed for a long time. And to be fair, being a business owner can be time consuming, and you might not always have the time to read or to educate yourself in history or literature. But I would say that it enriches your soul here, and it's food for the brain as well. So I would say, why not, actually? But yeah, it's a vision that many people had at the time. His work requires all his attention. It ought to be enough for him to have one great desire and to aim only at that. And that is? Asked Mr. Hale. Mrs. Thornton blushed as she answered, to have a high position among the manufacturers in this country. Idiot. As if, it was an obvious reason that was obvious. My son has earned his place for himself, this place for himself, all over Europe. The name of John Thornton of Milton, the name of John Thornton of Milton is respected among businessmen. Both Mr. Hale and Margaret felt uncomfortably aware that they had never heard of this great name until Mr. Bell had told them about him. The expression on Margaret's face revealed this to the sensitive Mrs. Thornton. You're thinking you've never heard of this wonderful son of mine, Miss Hale? Yes, it is true. But since I have been here, I've heard enough to make me respect and admire him. Mrs. Thornton smiled, but said, Thank you, Miss Hale. Many young women would not have said that, fearing that it would seem that they had plans to win my son's heart. She's fishing here. On hearing this, Margaret laughed, but stopped when she saw Mrs. Thornton's annoyed look. I'm sorry, madam, but I really am not interested in that way, she said. Young ladies have been before now, said Mrs. Thornton stiffly. I hope I will see Mr. Thornton on Thursday, said Mr. Hale, trying to change the subject. I cannot say. There will almost certainly be a strike. A strike? Why? Asked Margaret. The workers want higher wages, I suppose, said Mr. Hale. The workers want higher wages, I suppose, said Mr. Hale. That is what they say, but the truth is they want to be more powerful than the mill owners. They strike every 5 or 6 years, but I believe that if the men do strike, the mill owners have some ideas that will teach them not to do it again in a hurry. Tough one. That evening, Mr. Thornton came to see Mr. Hale. He was shown into the sitting room where Margaret was reading aloud to her father and mother. I have come partly to bring a note from my mother and partly to apologize for not coming for my lesson yesterday. The note contains the address you asked for. Thank you, said Margaret quickly, holding out her hand to take the note. She did not want her mother to know that her father, who was becoming worried about his wife's health, had asked Mr. Thornton to give them the name of a good doctor. Mr. Thornton seemed to understand immediately and gave her the note without another word of explanation. Mr. Hale began to talk about the strike. Mr. Thornton, looking angry, said, Yes, the fools are going to strike. They think the cotton trade is as good as it was last year. They want better pay, but because we won't explain why we have refused their demand and tell them we may have to lower wages, they think we are trying to cheat them. But why can't you explain your reasons? Asked Margaret. Do you give your servants reasons for the way in which you spend your money? We manufacturers have a right to choose what we do with it. What about the rights of the workers? said Margaret quietly. I'm sorry, I did not hear what you said. I would rather not repeat it, she said. I don't think you will understand. Please try and explain, said Mr. Thornton, who really wanted to know what she had said. I meant that the workers have rights too. Surely they deserve to know why you cannot pay them more. Mr. Thornton paused for a moment and then said, in my opinion, the workers are like children. I do not think we mill owners try to keep them like that. It is just the way they are. They need to be told what to do. And, like children, they do not need to be given reasons why. Margaret replied, I very much disagree with you. There should be friendship and cooperation between the manufacturers and their workers. We all depend on each other. The conversation continued, with neither side willing to change their position. Mr. Thornton got up to go. Margaret smiled at him, but did not put out her hand. And again, as he left, he told himself that she was unpleasantly proud. That night, as the Thorntons sat in their sitting room, Mrs. Thornton asked her son what he had done that day. On hearing that he had visited the Hales, Fanny said, are they really so different to most people on meets? Her words annoyed her brother, but he did not reply. They do not seem unusual to me, said Mrs. Thornton. He appears a good kind of man, not clever enough to be in the trade. The wife sees herself as a lady. The girl is the one who puzzles me. She seems to have great self-importance, and I can't understand why. They're not rich, and from what I understand, they never have been. And she can't even play the piano, mother, said Fanny. Go on, Fanny. What else does she need to bring her up to your standard? Said Mr. Thornton, who was walking up and down the sitting room. Then he stopped and said bravely, Mother, I want you to like Miss Hale. Why? She asked, surprised. You're not thinking of marrying her? A girl without any money? She would never have me, he answered with a short laugh. From what she told me, I don't think she would, said his mother. Her opinion of herself is far too high to think of you. If these words hurt her son, the fading evening light hid the expression on his face, and in a minute he said cheerfully, well, I'm sure of that too, and I have no intention of asking her to be my wife. But I see trouble for that girl. Her mother is very ill, and I would like you to be a friend to her, in case she needs one. I cannot forgive her pride, said his mother. But because you ask me, John, I will be her friend if she needs it. I'm so tired of this subject, said Fanny. Well, said her brother rather bitterly, shall we talk about the strike then? The men at the hampers mill are going to strike tomorrow. Mine will strike next week. You're going to have difficulty completing your business orders, said Mrs. Thornton, looking worried. Can you get workers from Ireland? Yes, I can, and I will if the strikes goes on too long, but it will make our workers very angry. He continued walking up and down the room, not speaking but taking deep breaths from time to time. Fanny started chatting to her mother, and at 10 o'clock the family said good night. Mr. Thornton remained in the room, anxiously considering his position. Because of the strike, all his business plans were in confusion. The workers seemed to him to be completely mad. I can give them a fortnight, no more. If they haven't understood the situation by then, I'll be forced to get workers from Ireland, he thought. In the second week of the strike, Margaret went to visit Bessie. So remember, Bessie is Nicholas Higgins' daughter. She's very sick, and she got really close to Margaret. They got friend. They became friends. When she arrived, Nicholas Higgins and his daughter were sitting by the fire. Nicholas, who was smoking a pipe, stood up, pushing his chairs towards Margaret. She sat down and inquired about Bessie's health. She's upset about the strike. She doesn't like it. This is the third strike I've seen. This is the third strike I've seen, said Bessie, sighing. We'll win this time. You can be sure of that, said Nicholas. Why are you striking? Asked Margaret. There are 5 or 6 mill owners who want to pay us less than we get now, replied Nicholas, and we won't agree. We'll die first. But don't think I'm striking for myself. There are only three in my family, but John Boucher, next door, has a sick wife and 6 children. He can't manage with the wages he has now from the mill. How is he going to live on less? Perhaps you should ask the mill owners why they want to pay less. The reason may be that the business is not good. I don't believe that, said Nicholas angrily. The mill owners will say anything. They use us so that they can get rich. But this time, they'll have to give in. They've got a lot of business orders and they need us to do the work. Bessie sighed heavily when she heard this, and Margaret said, You don't like all this struggling and fighting, do you? No, said Bessie. I'm tired of it all. All this shouting and talking of work and wages. Oh, the tobacco smoke makes me feel ill. Then I'll never smoke in the house. As it was about her father. Talk of wages. The tobacco smoke makes me feel ill. Then I'll never smoke in the house again, said her father gently. But why didn't you tell me before? Receiving no answer, he went outside to finish his pipe. And Bessie said in a low voice, He needs his pipe. It's one of the few comforts he has. His work is so hard and boring. And when a strike begins, everyone's so hopeful at first, and then it goes on, and people get angry and depressed. Maybe you're exaggerating because you're not well, said Margaret. No, I'm not exaggerating. People have been coming to see us, and they all say how much they hate the mill owners. I've seen women crying because they have no money to buy food, and their children are so hungry, so hungry, they can't sleep at night. You're looking more and more feverish, Bessie, and your hand is so hot. Margaret found some water, wet her handkerchief, and laid it on Bessie's forehead. Here. I must go, she said, but I'll come back soon. You're not like anyone I've ever known. I don't know what to think of you. I don't know what to think of myself. Goodbye. Bessie watched her as she walked out of the house. I wonder if there are many people like her down south. She's so strong and bright. But will she stay like that? I wonder. So that's Bessie, I guess, talking to herself. So that's the end of chapter 5. So a lot to talk about here, the relationship between the mill owners and the workers and their different views on trade. And here we can see when Mr. Thornton and Margaret are having this discussion and disagreeing on the way Mr. Thornton sees the fact that he doesn't have to give any reasons why he wants to pay them less. Here, Margaret says, but you should be more open to your workers, is a very modern view for the time. And this is Elizabeth Gaskell's view, because the message in this novel is to display, to show another way of handling business and a more human approach towards business and trade, and um, and through her character, through the character of Margaret and Nicholas Higgins, we she's trying to pass on this message for more humanity in the business, in the capitalism society that we're still on and that we're still living from, and there's and you see, this is the 19th century, and those values are so contemporary to our time. When you hear in the news, oh, they're closing this factory, and now they're closing this other factory, and they because they want to delocal um, for delocalization, I guess. That's the term. Well, to basically close the factory here in a rich country, or in France, for example, to open it in another country where the workforce is less expensive and make more profits. It's still something that is relevant to our modern society, unfortunately. So that's why this is a classic, because the topic is still relevant to nowadays. Anyway, chapter 6. So now we're continuing with chapter 6, The Shadow of Death. So we are page 32. Hi, thank you for joining. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to drop the question in the comment, and also below this video in the comments. Okay, Dr. Donaldson, the doctor recommended by Mr. Thornton, came to call on Mrs. Hale soon after Margaret's visit to Bessie. Margaret was not allowed into the room while he was there, but Dixon was, and this made her feel very jealous. So remember, Dixie is Mrs. Hale's maid, and the two of them are very close to each other, and Margaret suffers a little bit from this from their relationship, and she wished she was in the room with her mother, and that her mother would want to have her next to her. She waited anxiously outside, and when the doctor came out, she said quickly, "My father is out. Would you come downstairs?" Dr. Donaldson followed her into Mr. Hale's study. "What is the matter with with mother?" Margaret asked. The doctor hesitated, and she said, "If the news is bad, my father must be told the news gently. Only I can do this." "My dear, your mother said that you must not be told. I feel sure that you have not promised to keep the secret." "Well," said the doctor, smiling sadly, "you're right. I did not promise. In fact, I'm afraid you will all know soon enough." Margaret went very white, but no part of her face moved. Dr. Donaldson was a man who understood people well, and he saw immediately that she was strong enough to be told the truth. He spoke. Sorry. He spoke 2 sentences in a low voice, watching her all the time. Her eyes grew wide and she went even whiter. Then she said, I've been afraid of this for many weeks. She began to cry, but a few moments later, the tears stopped. Will my mother suffer much? She asked. He shook his head. I can't say, but the latest discoveries of medical science can help a lot. My father, she said, trembling all over. We must not be told. He must not be told the truth yet, not all at once. It would kill him. I do not know Mr. Hale, so it is difficult to give advice, but I will visit often, and your father will be a little more prepared for the truth. And when I come again, it will be as a friend. Margaret was crying so much that she could not speak, but she shook the doctor's hand as he left. That's a fine girl, thought Dr. Donaldson as he sat in his carriage. What a queen she is. The way she threw her head back, forcing me to tell her the truth. If I were 30 years younger, I would have fallen in love with her. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her father's study, trying to find some strength. After some minutes, she ran upstairs. Her mother was lying in an armchair, looking quite peaceful. Margaret, how strange you look. What is the matter? Suddenly guessing the truth, Mrs. Hale said, Dr. Donaldson hasn't been talking to you, has he? Child? Oh, yes, mother, he did. I made him. Margaret knelt by her mother's side and started to cry and kiss her hand. So knelt, she was on her knees. Yeah, knelt. Oh, mother, let me be your nurse. It will be such a comfort to me. My poor child, Dixon and I thought you should not know. Dixon thought, said Margaret scornfully. I'm your daughter, mother. I only want to be near you. In Harley Street, I used to cry in bed at night, thinking you would forget me. Harley Street is the London house, where her aunt's house. Remember, she lived with her aunts for many years, and it was on Harley Street. And I used to. So here it's interesting that she doesn't say at Auntie's house. She says in Harley Street. So that's very 19th century. And I used to wonder, what will Margaret think of our little cottage after her luxurious life with Aunt Shaw? Oh, mother, how can you say that? I loved Helston so much. I shall never see Helston again. But Margaret, Frederick, Mrs. Hale started sobbing. Frederick, come to me. I am dying. Come to me. Dixon came running in, and they lifted Mrs. Hale into her bed. Margaret sat with her until she fell asleep. Then the two women went into the sitting room to talk. Look what you've done to your mother, and now I suppose you'll tell your father, Dixon said angrily. No, Dixon, said Margaret sorrowfully. I won't tell him. He would be too upset. And she burst into tears. Miss Margaret, my dear, I've had to keep this secret for so long, and your mother's the person I love most in the world. Oh, Dixon, said Margaret, I've been cross with you so often, not realizing what a terrible burden you were carrying. You dear child. Now you go out for a long walk, and you'll feel better. I'll look after your mother. I will. Margaret gave Dixon a kiss and left the room. Dixon watched her as she walked down the street. She's as sweet as a nut, that girl. There are three people I love: her mother, Frederick, and her. She doesn't say Mr. Hale. She doesn't like him. Her father's always been too busy thinking and reading to look after my lady properly. And look what's happened to him. Poor child. Her clothes look old. In Helston, she didn't need to mend her socks or clean her gloves. And now, when Mr. Hale came home, well, in Helston they were richer. Yeah. Oh, more rich. Richer. Anyway, when Mr. Hale came home several hours later, he inquired anxiously about Dr. Donaldson's visit. Margaret told him that the doctor did not think her mother was seriously ill at present, but that he felt she needed care. He had given her some medicine and would visit frequently. Mr. Hale's nervous reaction showed that he realized that his wife might be in danger. All that evening, he kept going into his wife's bedroom to see if she was still asleep. Finally, he came back, looking comforted. She's awake now, Margaret. She's asked for a cup of tea. During the next week, Mrs. Hale's health improved, and the family began to hope that she would recover. But in the streets outside, there was an atmosphere of gloom and discontent. Mr. Hale knew several workers and was depressed by their stories of hunger and suffering. When Mr. Thornton next came to visit, Mr. Hale told him these stories. The mill owner explained that, in business, profits depended to some extent on the country's economy. When times were difficult, some manufacturers would lose their businesses and their workers would lose their jobs as a result. He spoke without emotion, seeming to feel that neither the employer nor the workers had a right to complain. Mr. Thornton's coldness shocked Margaret. How could he talk as if trade was the only thing that mattered? When he had arrived that afternoon, he had offered to help her mother in any way he could. Margaret could not understand how those eyes, which were so kind when he talked about her mother, could belong to the same man who spoke about his workers so pitilessly. Later that week, Margaret visited Bessie, who seemed even more exhausted than usual. The girl told her a sad story about the Boucher family next door. John Boucher, one of the strikers, had suddenly died 3 days ago. But this was not all. Mrs. Boucher was becoming more and more unwell, and the youngest child was so weak with hunger that he was likely to die. The story shocked Margaret, and she immediately took out her purse and pressed the money into Bessie's hand. When she returned home, she told her parents about the family, and the next day a big basket of food was sent to them. That evening, Margaret and her father went for a long walk, and as they returned home, began to discuss Mr. Thornton. "He must know how much his workers hate him," said Margaret. "They think he has no feelings." "I disagree. In my opinion, he's a passionate man, but he's too proud to show his emotions." "I'm not sure, but he's very clever and has a great strength of character, and I'm starting to like him a little." By now they were at their front door. Dixon opened it, and when they saw her face, they both started to tremble. "Thank God you've come. Dr. Donaldson is here. She's better now, but I thought she was going to die an hour ago." Mr. Hale took Margaret's arm to prevent himself from falling. "I should not have left her," cried Margaret. Dr. Donaldson met them inside. "She's better for the moment," he whispered. "For the moment? Let me go to her. cried Mr. Hale. They entered the bedroom. Mrs. Hale lay on the bed, and from the look on her face, it was clear to them all that death was near. Mr. Hale began to shake, and Dr. Donaldson took him downstairs and helped him into a chair. After some moments, Mr. Hale said, making a great effort, "Margaret, did you know about this? It was cruel of you." "I told her not to tell you," said Dr. Donaldson. "Your wife will sleep well tonight and will be better tomorrow, I hope. But what about the illness? Please tell me the truth. Cannot stop it, only delay it." Dr. Donaldson explained that they need not fear that Mrs. Hale would die immediately, but that she would not recover. He left, promising to return early in the morning. Both Mr. Hale and Dixon did not sleep for many hours. Margaret felt as if she would never sleep again. To the young woman watching by her mother's bed, her life, until that moment seemed unreal. Life seemed so shadowy and passed so quickly. When the morning came, cold and grey, it seemed as if the terrible night was also a dream. It, too, was past. When Mrs. Hale woke the next morning, she was unaware of how ill she had been, and was rather surprised by Dr. Donaldson's early visit and by the anxious faces of her husband and child. The doctor allowed her to return to the sitting room, but she was uncomfortable in every position, and that night she became very feverish. The doctor thought that a water bed might help and suggested that the family could borrow one from the Thorntons, since he knew they had one. "I could go and ask them to lend it to us while Mother is asleep," said Margaret. That afternoon, Mrs. Hale seemed much better, and Margaret left the house and set off for the Thorntons. And that's the end of chapter 6. I hope you enjoyed this live reading of North and South. This is quite a sad time. This is a sad time because we see that Mrs. Hale is not going to recover from her illness, and there is nothing that can do, but that the doctor can do. So it doesn't look very, very bright. The future doesn't look very bright. So we'll see what happens next. But on the other hand, you have the events of the strike at the same time. So you have a very intimate story on one side, and on the other you have those social political issues going on. So it's very rich in events and in terms of narrative. So that's why that's why I love this novel, and how there's so much we can say around the characters and around the topic of business and manufacture in the 19th century, and reflect on what is happening today in our modern society. Right. So I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you for watching, for being live on Instagram. And thank you for watching here this video on YouTube, or for listening on the Spotify podcast. Thank you so much again. And I also remind you that you can subscribe to the book club membership to attend our second live workshop on North and South and discuss more about the novel. Hi, thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you for listening. And I wish you a beautiful end of the day. And I will see you tomorrow for the fourth live reading session. We will read chapter 7 and 8 together, again, live on Instagram and also later on YouTube. Thank you so much. Thanks for your effort. Oh, thank you so much for um, taking the time to listen to this reading. I love it. I love sharing my love for reading and also um, making this novel accessible to learners or for non-native speakers. This is why I do this book club, and I'm glad that you enjoyed it and that you are learning more English words and vocabulary, but also that you're learning more about the life at the time. And I hope that you will be interested to know more about Elizabeth Gaskell, this beautiful, this amazing writer. She wrote so many other novels. And you can listen to the podcast episode, An Introduction to North and South and Elizabeth Gaskell. I talk more about her other novels and about her life. So you can check it out on YouTube and also on my Spotify podcast. Right. And if you want to follow what's happening with the book club, you can subscribe to the newsletter as well on my website. Thank you so much again. Bye. Bye bye.